Dzień dobry Państwu, ja się nazywam Przemysław Barański i miło jest mi Państwa powitać na debacie organizowanej przez Instytut Wolności, której tematem będzie reforma armii rosyjskiej w kontekście ćwiczeń Zapad 2017 i sytuacji strategicznej, jaka w związku z tym wywiązała się na wschodniej flance NATO i na wschodzie Europy. A naszymi gośćmi są pan mecenas Jacek Bartosiak, geopolityk, geostrateg, autor książki Pacyfik i Eurazja o wojnie, oraz pan Nicholas Myers, prezes think tanku War vs. Peace, który od lat zajmuje się polityką Federacji Rosyjskiej, Republiki Białorusi i siłami zbrojnymi obu tych państw. Oddaję mikrofon obu panom i życzę udanej debaty.
Debata będzie w języku angielskim, więc pozwolicie Państwo, że przestawimy się na ten język, dobrze? Okay, so I'm switching into English, and as we agreed with Nick Myers, who is, as it was introduced, a great thinker, military thinker, but as well a great strategist of, let me say that, of young generation of American strategists, and a great hope for the sea power of the United States, I guess, and a friend of mine with whom I have played many war games. At the Potomac and in Europe and so on. So I'm also looking forward to hearing some real stuff of which Nick is very well, known. So without further delay, let me start. Today's meeting will be divided into three sections. The first one will be a more or less 30 minutes long presentation by Nick about Zapad and the Russian armed forces, a new model army, yes, new Russian army. And later we'll have 20-30 minutes of, we'll be having a 30 minutes discussion between ourselves, and then even up to 1 hour of Q&A for you, so that it's a vivid discussion and active participation of all the participants and all people that are with us here. So that's the plan, and let's start. Nick.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'll apologize right from the start that besides dzień dobry and maybe potrzebuję pieniędzy, if I'm pronouncing that right, I don't know much of any Polish that I can speak. But I want to thank my good friend Jacek Bartosiak, as well as the... Oh.
It doesn't work.
I do want to thank my good friend Jacek Bartosiak and Instytut Wolności for allowing me to speak tonight. And I want to thank everybody for deciding that they want to spend their Friday night talking about the Russian military and the larger world than anything else. I'm going to be sitting down for the presentation. I usually prefer to stand, but it'll be easier for the recording. The slideshow that I have created is mostly references that are not necessarily a fixed presentation, but it should be a series of things that we can refer to as critical data points as things are changing around the world. I have a tendency to speak slightly fast, so I'm going to try to keep it slow as I go through English here. But as you can see, we're going to start by talking about some specifics of Zapad 2017. So this has gained a lot of notoriety in the news, since it's just a big ticket item. And we're going to expand gradually out to what is the broader changes going on in Eurasia at large, in a large geopolitical conversation. We'll add some specifics about what is Russia up to, and increasingly, does it matter? So what was Zapad 2017? Obviously, there was a lot of buildup beforehand of that. It was going to be this massive exercise, potentially overthrowing Belarus, potentially starting a major war with NATO. Then, for a variety of reasons, it materialized that it was not nearly so large, and started to raise questions as to, was this actually a deception attempt by the Russians to get us to overreact simply to see what we would do? But then I think the major goal of Zapad 2017 was achieved, which was getting the entire world to talk about Russian military power, regardless of whether or not it exists. And as I just said, we're all here on a Friday night talking now about the Russian military, so clearly something went right for him. So what is Zapad at large? It is a every 4-year exercise that serves as a capstone of all of the training that is done in a high command, of which Russia currently has 4, moving to 5 as they add in the Arctic. This exercise was interesting, and it is the first one of the Zapad series that I'm aware of in the post-Soviet era, which no units were brought in from outside of the Western military district. There was some centrally commanded units, such as long-range aviation, taking part. But in the past, we have always seen the central military district sent in echelon, as well as sometimes even from the south. But this time, the organization was conducted pretty much exclusively within the Western military district, but with parallel exercises going on elsewhere in Russia. And this is something that I call the expanded Zapad universe, which we will explore a bit in a moment. But the point of Zapad is they have all of these training things that they do, and you're trying to do them all at the same time. It's worthwhile practicing, even if you think you know all the pieces. They need to practice the commanders writing order after order after order to many different units in the field. And that is the point of having a gigantic exercise that everybody looks at from a military standpoint, as opposed to just keeping everything a secret, which they might otherwise do. So why did it matter? I think the biggest reason it was so overinflated with the news is that since it happens every 4 years, the last one was in 2013, before people cared about the Russian military again. There was obviously the minor wake-up with Georgia, but much of NATO just didn't hit the snooze button on the strategy, and off we went, waiting until suddenly Crimea convinced everybody, maybe we should pay attention. And as a consequence, much attention was paid. Russia also is not debatably a dangerous threat to Europe, even if an unlikely one, depending on your own personal perception or your own analysis. If Russia decided to attack Poland or to attack NATO at large, even if it lost, and if NATO acts in concert, it will lose in the larger sense. But it can destroy Poland anyway. And more importantly, even if the United States manages to destroy all of Russia as a consequence, that doesn't save Poland from being destroyed if a war happens. So the only way to win this game is to prevent the war from starting. But what was the big reason why 2014 was the changing point that in turn makes Zapad 2017 a bigger issue, such a huge issue? I think the answer is that with the crisis ongoing in Ukraine, it is changing everyone's perception, both in Europe and in the United States, as to where is the borders of Europe. Does it include all of Ukraine? Does the West end with Poland included, but everything else excluded? Are there countries in Western Europe that don't even think of some members of NATO, such as Turkey or Poland, as being part of an alliance they need to defend? These questions all came to the fore and caused a lot of consternation in the United States, where there was previously large-scale discussion of what is the future relevance of NATO. Is it just talking? Some would say that, and there is evidence to suggest that in the early 1990s, part of NATO's promise, or communication, let's not call it promise, to Russia was that, yes, we will add these countries in, like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, but NATO is going to become just a talking club. It's no longer really a military alliance. Today, it is quite clear NATO, again, is a military alliance, and it has a purpose in deterring Russian actions in addition to whatever overseas contingency efforts they want to support. And then finally, there is the question of Belarus, independent country or not. Does it exist at the mercy of a Russian military exercise or not? And it was something that was debated hotly both in Europe and in Belarus itself. And I think a lot of the reason why there was so much hype up of details before the Zapad 2017 exercise was that Belarus consented to release a lot of information that otherwise would have been kept quite secretive. One of the unusual aspects of Zapad 2017 is the degree to which the Russian Ministry of Defense actually released quite a lot of information, a lot of which I'm about to show real quickly, relative to its previous Zapad exercises. Some of this has to do with the fact that this one was more complicated, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the Belarusians were putting out this information anyway, so the Russians just needed a version out there. All right, so how it happened, this is not particularly complicated information. You'll get it from the internet. But I would emphasize, out of this list of things here, that of that magical 12,700 number that is probably not true, the breakdown, according to the Russians, was 5,500 Russians and 7,200 Belarusians. This is already a huge shift. Zapad 2013, I believe the official numbers were about 9,700 Russians with 200 Belarusians. So Belarus's contribution to this it comes in much larger. That said, part of the reason why I think this number is understated, or at least the more obvious reason why this number is understated, is that Zapad 2017 was not the only exercise going on in Russia at the time. There were lots of exercises going on at the same time that did not have the stamp Zapad on it, but were almost certainly part of the larger expanded Zapad universe, what is being played in the scenario. I know some experts have said that other exercises occurring as early as July and as late as October were also part of this same scenario. And there were exercises during Zapad 2017 in Kaliningrad that were not Zapad. There was so many exercises going on, it was difficult to keep track, but they were very clear wherever Russia wanted to. They would stamp Zapad on it and say, yes, it is part of the narrative for our people about why we are strong. And there were still exercises not accounted for that in Kaliningrad, among other places. So here are the 10, I think there's 11 listed on here, which I'll go over. There's 10 of the official exercise training ranges for Zapad. The 11th one is Glubokaya, the one in northwest Belarus. That one was Belarusian reservists practicing separately from the Russians, but clearly within the same time frame as Zapad at large. What were they doing? Well, if you follow all the news releases going on, it becomes fairly clear that there was specific programs that they were doing at each individual one of these training ranges. Before one reads too much into this, you should recognize that Struge Krasnya, for example, in Pskov area, is usually an airborne operations exercise range. So some of this is not very surprising. Domanovsky is an air defense range. Ruzhansky is Belarus's well-worn bomb site for Air Force. And then all the other ones are well-established polygons inside of both Russia and Belarus. But still, there are sufficient patterns here that you can see that there may have been some degree of how to practice setting up the logistics for a broader operation. What units deployed? I'm sorry the font is so small. We will, because there were so many units. But on all of these ones, there are a couple notations to get here. The Russians are on the left side of each of these columns, and the Belarusians are on the right. You can see there's a huge list of Russian units virtually everywhere. That's 5,500 soldiers, comprising all of that. It's important to mention that when they say, oh, we're deploying Second Guards, Kamanskaya Motor Rifle Division, not the whole division went there. It appears that they set up a battalion tactical group from it, and then most of the division stayed home. The 4th Guards Tank Division did deploy to Belarus, but with only its motor rifle regiment, actually. So, yes, you don't need to think of them as a gigantic massing of all things, but still, this is a ridiculous list of units that add up to 5,500 people. In addition, I would note the fact that no Belarusians left Belarus during the official 14 to 20 September exercise. Within weeks of the exercise done, maybe even within days, the Belarusians did send some of their special forces, they call them, it's a mobile brigade, into Russia to complete a separate exercise that appears to have also been within the Zapad universe. But during this time period, the Belarusians stayed in Belarus, which of course is different from Zapad 2013 when they famously stuck a whole bunch of those that same battalion onto a ship and had Belarus conduct its first amphibious warfare exercise into Kaliningrad on 2013 because Belarus needs Marines. So let's post those polygons inside of Russia at large. And these red lines you see behind them, these are the military district borders of Russia. Everything to the left of that big red line is in the west. At the bottom is the south. The big thing on the right is the central. And then the one in the north it's called North. It's not really a military district yet, but it's being administratively run separately. And Russia pretty clearly intends to turn it into a proper military district for Arctic operations. So what were the other exercises going on during Zapad by location? This is exclusively just between 14 and 20 September. Anything that has a black mark around it is non-Zapad exercises that were going on at the same time. The blue represents exercises by the National Guard. These do not get reported so much. Some people have emphasized that MVD did a major deployment of their own forces during Zapad 2009. But MVD was folded into a larger group of paramilitary forces within Russia called Rosgvardia, or the Russian National Guard. And they don't exercise very frequently on this tactical level, but you see this week they're doing quite a lot of things, especially around St. Petersburg, and that Lomonosov exercise, the one directly to the left and on the lower half of St. Petersburg area, that was a proper defensive exercise and not simply, we're learning how to drive a complicated car. In fact, most of these were specifically exercising how to reinforce the rapid reaction units that they have been standing up in a way that I think is pretty complementary with what the Soviets used to call rear area operations. And some of this is safeguarding things from potential NATO horizontal escalation, and some of it could be practicing how to deploy rapidly from a home base into potentially doing security behind the front line in the Baltic states in a hypothetical scenario. But if we add in everything from September 2017, we now see why so much confusion exists, because a map of Russia starts to drown in exercises. If you look at the chart I put at the top right there, there are 11 pieces of Zapad going on. The Ministry of Defense is doing 120 separate ones that are not Zapad, and then there's a total of 140. So if you take it just as a list of what events were exercised in Russia, Zapad in September 2017 is less than 1/5 of everything that Russia did. And indeed less than a tenth if you include all the National Guard exercises. Some of them probably don't have anything to do. I cut off the math there arbitrarily at where this picture ends. Additional things were going on in the East, not quite as large a numbers, but I don't think that they were specifically within the expanded Zapad universe. So that's a long cry from just this. So what was significant about this exercise, and why was it special if it was? The most important thing was that it was designed for a domestic audience to prove that Russia is strong. They had sufficient press coverage within Russia to say, yes, we accomplished a huge checklist of things. We know how to shoot off rockets. We know how to injure military attachés visiting a site. But also foreign press reports saying Zapad is a big deal, or NATO needs to exercise in 3 different places, because there was the exercise going on in Sweden, which was technically not NATO. There was exercise in Poland, I forget which one that one was, but the exercise going on in, not Poland, Latvia and Ukraine going on at the same time. It's like, oh, NATO is very worried about what Russia is doing, so they need to have all these exercises and overreact. So clearly they are not strong enough to deal with us. So it succeeded at accomplishing its propaganda message to the Russian people. There is a potential role for this National Guard in the Zapad context. This, for some reason, doesn't get talked about really anymore in the West, whereas it was a big deal for Zapad 2009. I do think that there is some role to be played here, not necessarily, but it seems likely based on their frequency of exercises relative to when Zapad was going on, that they have something to do with it. The other aspect, growing pains. As we hear, Russia's adding all of these divisions around its military. A lot of that is going to require inserting additional hardware and manpower to make sure these divisions actually operate at division strength. And it has had the short-term effect of reducing Russian combat readiness. It will increase again over time, but Russia today is no longer Russia of the 1990s, where if they want to increase their footprint, they just pull out a whole bunch of tanks that have been sitting in a bunker for the last couple of years. These days, those tanks that have been sitting in those bunkers might be maintained. Not all, but might be some. But they're now so outdated that they're not nearly as useful as they might have been in the 90s. So it's no longer really part of Russian military planning to just deploy all 50,000 tanks that may or may not be sitting in a warehouse somewhere. So in the meantime, they have to deal with the fact that they're logistically kind of stuck between two worlds at the moment, and it's probably why they did smaller deployments within the larger units, like just the battalion tactical groups from the major divisions of the 1st Guards Tank Army. That's more of a hypothesis than any conclusion, but still there's evidence to suggest it. And the last one I would point out is something called Northwest Strategic Direction. In Soviet tradition, a strategic direction simply refers to an area of operations, and it goes often to a particular often a particular way. In Belarus, there are two of these, west and northwest, so we know which way they're looking. But the last two exercises they've played overtly, they're playing the Belarusian Western Strategic Direction, which is why the Russians deploy right up to the Polish border, because the Western Strategic Direction implies that there's a conflict with Poland. This time, they were very overt about how this was the Northwest Strategic Direction. The Belarusians released this map of the hypothetical countries that were being played against in Zapad. So Vesnoria is the bright magenta there, right next to Minsk, that everybody talked about. But in the background, you have Viesbardia, which is a pretty good Russian mangling of Lithuanian. And then Pubinia in the Masurian Lakes region, or including the Suwalki Gap. And these were the states that were aiding and abetting the big bad guys that were trying to have their own way inside Belarus. So when you see talks from the exercise of, oh, we're going to shoot Iskanders at deep strikes, I'll bet you they were going inside of those two notional countries, which means that it was a Baltic-focused exercise, and not overtly about trying to get to Warsaw or Poland in general. Obviously, Poland is included in the back, so clearly, I don't think that they suspect that Poland is going to sit with most of its forces tied down. But if we compare these polygons from Zapad 2017 to the past to demonstrate how this is different, Zapad 2013, they exercised here, again, right on the Polish border, and they did a much clearer job of saying that they were doing strategic defensives of rapid movement towards where they've discovered people trying to get across the border in both the Brest and Grodno areas. All Zapad exercises have two phases. The first one, defensive, absorbing the attack and preparing for striking back, and the second one, when they go on the march to wherever their objectives are, whether it's back in Berlin or to the Belarusian border. They usually don't say. Zapad 2009, they were a bit further back, but still concentrated closer to Poland than necessarily towards the Baltics in general. The other one I would point out is Union Shield 2015. So this series of exercises called Shitsayuza in Russian occur in the off-odd years that Zapad doesn't take place. They include Belarusian support. They're not technically strategic operational exercises, but they are fairly large. What's notable about Union Shield 2015 is that in addition to bringing out Belarusians to assist in the defense of St. Petersburg, it was taking place at the exact same time as Center 2015, which is the strategic operational direction going in the middle of Russia. And what's notable about that was that one they didn't lie, at least overtly, about. They said it was a 90,000-man exercise with snap exercises flying in every direction as they're spending all of their money to show that Russia is great in 2015 while everyone's quaking around them. So they were able to pull this off at the same time that they were doing that gigantic exercise out in Kazakhstan. So I'm going to start pulling back from specific exercises and talk about how we're going to start moving broader now. I promise you I'm going to be a bit faster about getting to geostrategic issues. So how does Russia perceive the threat environment it's dealing with in Zapad? This map, I forget precisely where it came out from. I think the Belarusians reprinted it. Is a Russian conspiracy theory of how NATO would attack Russia and why they needed to do Zapad. So you can see here that there's a whole set of NATO cores inside the Baltic states that are being used to isolate all the unhappy separated Russians in Transnistria, etc., to open a corridor across the Intermarium. We have a giant attack coming out of Norway. I think if we showed this to any NATO commander, he would be thrilled to realize that he has these capabilities sitting right there at the Russian border, able to strike back immediately. Because I see on here that Poland doesn't even get struck. It might have some guys relatively near it in Belarus still, but they're coming out pretty strong and already starting to get to Moscow at the edge of that blue arrow. And obviously the Turks are complying very happily with this, I'm sure, as you see an arrow coming in from the bottom going into the south. Whether or not this is entirely a hoax, we can decide for ourselves, but this is the threat situation that they talk about. This whole concept that the Baltic states are now dangerous because there's so much NATO force being constructed there. And they also complain that despite all efforts to communicate that this was not directed at any particular third party and that this is just a regular exercise, the West insisted on doing 3 large-scale exercises elsewhere in Europe at the same time that we're doing Zapad 2017 because they're clearly an aggressive force. I tend to be of the view on this that there really is a mutual failure to understand here. What we are doing is reinforcing areas that feel threatened by Russia. Like the Baltic states want multinational corps northeast to be stationed there. If they didn't, the United States would never consent to allow it. But there is, I think, a real willingness to believe among the Russian policy elite that this actually is a sign of bad times to come because of improper leadership in the West. In the same way that we would say, if Russia wants to challenge Poland, that's clearly a mistake on their part because Poland's not about to try to take anything from Russia. But this sort of necessity of having a vital enemy in order to justify function is a critical part of how Russia approaches ordinary politics. So take that as you will. How does this fit into the development of Russian military thought since 1945? I go back all the way to 1945 because that was the year in which Russia beat the country that they always compare themselves to, always will compare themselves to, and still can't really imagine that they won, namely Germany. Germany beat them up pretty bad in the First World War, and now they managed to succeed. And no matter what the Allies say about how you should behave after this, why does Russia care? Russia can do whatever it wants because it won the war. Well, afterwards, there was considerable debate as to, well, how do we defend ourselves if NATO's really going to try to tell us that communism is wrong, if they still won't agree that we clearly know what we're doing, despite the fact that we, and we alone, can beat all the fascists in the world. So they begin a process of how to make the military more effective that's been a continuous debate since then. And so I think that it's appropriate to look at the dialectic starting in 1945, because the lessons that they took away as succeeding in the Second World War became the basis for everything they did afterwards, even if those particular operational concepts were designed by individual professors in the 1920s or the 1900s or the 19th century. And so the concept arose rapidly that the obvious way that you would stop the West from being able to beat up on us is we will seize what's left of Western Europe, this blue part here that forms NATO, before the United States can really do anything about it. And are they really going to start the end of all wars trying to invade their way back in? And that became the basis of all Russian thought, at least until 1981, was can we get all the way to at least France, maybe even into Iberia. Spain and Portugal were not part. Portugal was. Spain was not a part of NATO until the 80s, I want to say. Can we do that before the United States has a chance to seriously defend? And I think this is still how Russia thinks. How much can we accomplish before something serious happens to us? And when we get to that point where that seriousness is introduced, how do we stop the war then when we happen to be wherever we are, whether that's all the way to Białystok or all the way to Berlin? It doesn't. The concept is how do we freeze whatever we can accomplish by then, before we are roundly defeated by everybody coming through. The modifications that occur over time happen largely in response to the fact that NATO decides to up the technological game so that they can slow Russia down long enough that America and France adjust to the fact that our soldiers are being killed, and then all countries mobilize and stop the Soviet Union from ever getting to all the way to France. So the Soviets start coming up with increasingly clever means of how they're going to rapidly collapse the NATO front line. So what you're seeing here is a lovely vintage picture of the layer cake that was West German defense throughout the majority of the Cold War. The layer cake, I'm almost certain, was adopted because the different countries didn't want to talk to each other, most especially anyone with the Germans at the time. So they were able to keep a separate command structure. And then the Russians, in turn, would concentrate their own forces according to what were the areas they could break through fastest. So the classical one that we constantly hear about is... Here, I want to pull out my... No, I don't have it. Never mind. The classical one we hear about is, you see this Belgian corps right above the North Ag line. Right, you see the line with the four X's. There's this place called labeled Belgian. They thought the Belgians are not going to be able to hold that because the Belgians like to go home for the weekend. So if we get all the way, if we blast through there, we can get behind the British Corps, force them to surrender because they're going to be too busy fighting at the front. And by then, we can start swooping all the way back up to the Netherlands, at which point the Dutch Corps will surrender by itself. And now we've knocked out all of North Ag in however many hours we think that it will take to do this. Maybe a couple of days if the preparations don't go... If the preparations for NATO are completed, but it becomes games like this. How do we cause the collapse rapidly so that we can accelerate elsewhere? And when you look at late Cold War games, almost always the Soviets conclude that they can get all the way to Paris, and the U.S. and West German corps in Bavaria may not necessarily have surrendered. Munich is now its last little island of defense. And then after they've lost everything else, then they finally surrender because they see that everything's dead. So you'll talk to American GIs who were stationed in Europe, and they will tell you about the Fulda Gap, which is in that U.S. sector south of the Centag line there. The whole point of the Fulda Gap was to convince the Americans, the Soviets are coming straight at us, and we can beat them. therefore distracting them from actually saving other NATO countries that are collapsing on the side, because they're currently committed to a battle that they feel that they're winning, because the Soviets aren't necessarily trying to win there. They're trying to cause they're trying to cause the diversion sufficiently that they can achieve operational success elsewhere. You couple this in with things like the combined air operation, where they were going to try to destroy, not necessarily destroy, but keep NATO air on the ground for maybe 3 days while their entire Soviet Air Force is just destroyed by NATO air defense. It doesn't matter, because in 3 days of no NATO air support, we might have broken through who knows how much. We don't really care if all of our pilots are dead if we won the war, especially if we won the war before nuclear weapons are used, because as every Soviet training manual will tell you, nuclear weapons will only be used when the West knows it has lost and needs to kill everybody, because they're these terrible imperialists. That is the basic operational concept that Russia developed over time. So what has changed? At the end of the Cold War, Russia moved back, and all of a sudden they don't know what exact plan they need to address, because, as I mentioned earlier, NATO is making talks about becoming just a talking shop, no longer really an alliance, and even if they were an alliance, Russia's not necessarily a declared enemy. We are willing to talk about Russia joining NATO. I remember still seeing headlines about this as late as 2006. I never heard it again after Georgia, but still, it was a long time to continue talking about this. And so Russia reevaluated what were its top security concerns. Here's a map of all the military districts of Russia as they exist today. The darker lines represent where the old military districts were. Russia concluded that there were 3 primary threats to Russia that should look out for about 1990 up until 2004, when the transition point starts. And overtly they remain these threats until 2014. But number 1, radical Islam. The Chechens convinced them that radical Islam will cause all sorts of problems, and they were most concerned about Central Asia. Number 2, when will North Korea collapse? We don't want a bunch of North Koreans potentially running up to Vladivostok, because Russians still think that being in Russia is much better than being in China, which I wouldn't take that bet anymore. That's not the nicest part of China, over next to North Korea. And number 3, the very vague possibility that the United States might start an alliance that's actively anti-Russian. But in terms of procurement priorities, they thought that since radical Islam is the most prevalent threat that's killing Russians today, everything should be put into reinforcing this green part, the central military district. And you still see a lot of references to that up until about 2013, that they're underrepresented in the central area, which they never had to defend in the past, and things might go wrong there, especially if Afghanistan continues to be held by radical Islam, which they had experience fighting before the end of the Soviet Union. So it fits in with a larger narrative. What they don't understand as they enter 2014 is that because of this emphasis on first that brown part, the southern military district where the fight against Chechnya is going, and the green part, the aspirational area where they want the capacity to rebuff radical Islamists from ever gaining ground elsewhere in Russia, is that they have no forces on the Ukrainian border. And when the real crisis that they perceive shows up, that Ukraine might not want to be a de facto Russian buffer zone, now they have to completely reimagine their whole security notion that they've been developing since 1945. It's not the first time it was a radical change. Obviously, in 1991, they see a pretty massive shift over to this model. But now, similar to NATO waking up, Russia needs to wake up and figure out, how do we structure a military capable of fighting a war of the style of Ukraine, because that's the one that's the immediate threat, which is requiring a lot more occupation forces than they ever anticipated. And number 2, taking this notional non-contact warfare thing that they never truly developed a good concept, a good operational plan for, that they said they did in the Western Military District, and turn into something that they feel confident could deter a Western attack if they perceived it coming. And I won't mince words on the fact that I believe Moscow is not lying when they claim that the West orchestrated the coup in Kiev. Not that it was a coup, but that Moscow really does believe that it was a Western coup. So when they say, yes, it's just a junta regime, I don't think that they really are believing that they're making it up. We can discuss Euromaidan separately. I, for one, believe that it was a popular uprising against an exceptionally incompetent government. But, again, the narratives are conducive to this clash. So, in this larger context, though, how is Russia faring, despite the fact that it has to readjust itself? This chart here comes from a project called Correlates of War. All measurements of aggregate national power have their own drawbacks, and this one, as you can see, is a summary of 6 components. I list them at the bottom: defense expenditure, military personnel, iron and steel production, energy consumption, population, and the urbanization of that population. And what they do is they take the raw numbers that each country is spending or has in personnel and adds all of them up for the world on a year-by-year basis and figures out what percentage of all of that is this country possessing. And then they average those percentages together to come up with this random aggregate score. Is it useful? It isn't as much as you can measure it year by year by year and see what's going on, but obviously you see Russia near the top in the late Cold War because it's producing a 1930s-style economy still. And what we can perceive here is the degree to which these manufacturing capabilities and just raw military assets has completely left the Russian advantage. They've all gone over to China, while the United States has pretty much stayed at its spot. And we can say that the sloping downward of the United States and Europe represents a growing degree of sophistication of the economy that moves us away from iron and steel production. But in some cases in Europe, most especially the UK, is that manufacturing has so completely disappeared that perhaps they no longer have one of their individual capabilities of producing military power. The last factory that can produce the Challenger 2 tank went out of business a couple of years ago. The British government decided it was not worth spending the money to save it. This is an extreme difference from obviously the 1840s, when British manufacturing was so cheap that it drove the European economy to ruin and completely remade much of how Europe's person-by-person economy functioned. One of the I used to live in Tartu for about a year, and the local brewery there had been there since the 1910s, but it was originally founded in southern Germany in the 1820s. But were so destroyed by British competition, they moved to London in the 1840s because it was the only place where they could afford to produce beer, but they still produced it in the German style and sent it back to where they came from originally. And then eventually, they discovered that the Russians were the ones drinking the most of it, so they moved to Estonia and have been there ever since. This sort of wild stories of remaking the European economy as a result of the Industrial Revolution at the beginning, when the locus of power moves away from just who can control all the who controls the passes in Europe, becomes who controls the course of trade in the UK as part of a large-scale shift towards the maritime world that I know Jacek Bartosiak likes to talk about. And obviously, these forces are moving in China's favor if we look at this classical world. So we have to ask, what is the influence that China potentially has on Europe as an alternative to Russia and the United States? This chart is put out by the Mercator Institute in Berlin, and it represents a variety of ways in which the Chinese are influencing individual European countries. So the size of the bubble, I believe the size of the bubble represents a proportion it represents absolute totals, not necessarily proportions to how large the individual countries are. But you can see these outsized groups of influence being put into places like the Baltic states, into Hungary, into Croatia, and into other places in the Balkans, places that for Brussels is the periphery, something that they don't necessarily care about very often. At least in Poland, you have the advantage of being a large country, so you can make noise a bit more easily than a place like Slovenia. And even then, I know Poland has some difficulties with Brussels at any given moment. I can't imagine any country that wouldn't have difficulties with Brussels at any particular moment. But as you combine all of these forces, you start to see that China is a serious player in how the broader geopolitical game of influence in a disunited Europe plays out. Obviously, the big countries that China has already bought up influence over are Greece and Croatia, who now can regularly vote down joint EU resolutions condemning Chinese human rights violations. But we can see the potential from this chart of plenty of other places that might soon find it fiscally useful to follow China's line. And it then invites the questions, what are the geopolitical purposes that China might be pursuing or would have the option to pursue if it gained more allegiance in the governments of these respective countries that they insert resources into? So here we have the picture of Belt and Road initiatives, and I find it difficult to find a comprehensive picture. This one is better than some, but still not the best. And part of the reason of that is China's somewhat inconsistent about describing something as a Belt and Road project or not. We see that, to a certain extent, Russia is getting placed into the system of Chinese control if it decides to play nice. And if it doesn't decide to play nice, then China can potentially just go around it anyway, in the effort for China to reach Europe. Now, Jacek likes to tell me that as an American, I can't really perceive what exact risk this is, but I can say that, completely hypothetically speaking, if all of these initiatives came through, and now you can zip across Kazakhstan and not even know it's there because of increased technology, for instance, China becomes very similar to the United States in a sea-dominated environment, and simply its magnitude of market, as well as relative military power, and it has the opportunity to drastically rewrite the rules the same way that the United States rewrote the rules of interstate relations in Latin America over 100 years ago. If you ever look at stories of the composition of Latin American militaries, it's all determined by treaties signed in 1946, 1947, 1948, in which the United States gathered everybody together near Mexico City and said, you will not develop nuclear weapons or we will destroy you. And no one disagreed. Cuba eventually did, but so they brought in some friends. And those treaties stand today, long after the Cold War. No one questions them because Latin America can't challenge the United States. If I bring up that correlates of war score again, the United States is 65% of all of the Western Hemisphere for those measurements, and includes Canada and the 35% other. But Latin America has also enjoyed the fruits of not having to fight any wars. You look at the history of Latin America in the 19th century, they fought a lot of large wars. The War of the Triple Alliance killed 90% of Paraguayan males. There are stories from Europe of British and German gentlemen with nothing to do going to Paraguay because everybody wanted them because there were no men around. And this would go on for 70 years after the war was over. So Latin America is now completely under the American thumb by a whole bunch of agreements from the height of American power in the 1940s, but no one particularly minds because of the degree of peace. That may change over time, especially if the United States continues to ignore Latin America, but this is not the fission point of the world in the way that places around China are today. So it is important to think about what are the implications of China now being the United States able to potentially dictate terms to other countries in Eurasia. It's important to emphasize here that if China does succeed at this sort of grand project, which I think will require at least several decades to accomplish that much infrastructure construction, it will not be as disproportionately powerful as the United States unless future technologies become so disruptive to the current balance of power that we have to completely reimagine what is or is not important. But today, China can be appropriately balanced by a coalition of India and Russia and Japan if they really wanted to. And if the United States gets behind any particular one of those, again, China is balanced. But China doesn't necessarily want to start a conflict with the United States. They may complain about U.S. behavior in a variety of ways, especially when the U.S. calls out Chinese actions, but I still haven't seen them willing to get any Americans hurt on purpose. So what are Poland's challenges then? Obviously, the Putin one I don't think is a particular surprise. If someone, I heard someone at a conversation a while back ask, why doesn't Poland try to talk to Putin to figure out how we can come up with a peaceful solution? The answer is actually pretty simple, because what does Poland have to offer to Putin that's going to make him happy? Because you go to Russia, the Moscow's geopolitical purposes is sort of a vacuum. It takes the resources of everywhere and puts it where it thinks it belongs. So if Poland wants to get involved in that, that means you give whatever Poland is to Moscow to distribute to wherever Moscow wants it. And I don't think anyone in this room would say that that's a good idea. But Russia may or may not be a significant challenger in the future. Zapad has its role in this debate because it calls attention to what role Russia plays in determining European security. And as a consequence, everybody here came in to listen to me talk about the Russian military, and now I'm starting to talk about Chinese long-term ambitions to potentially take over Europe. It's misdirecting things, trying to increase Russia's importance and get us away from thinking about this Russia stuck at 4% of the world's active production. And we have to ask ourselves, what are the implications of the future of a strong Russia, the implications of a future of a strong Russia that becomes more cooperative to Western interests for whatever reason, or the implications of a Russia that vanishes as a cohesive entity, either literally in terms of fragmentation to smaller states, or just becomes a rusting pile of nuclear weapons that doesn't necessarily go away, but it can no longer really influence the world around it other than preventing people from attacking it. And obviously, the Xi Jinping issue I've already brought up, and there's a number of more conjectural items about what I think of Xi Jinping's philosophy that I don't want to go into right at this moment. Now, some people in the room might ask, well, isn't there a third person missing from this pile of problems that might be coming in Poland's direction? And the reason why certain Mr. Trump does not make this slide is because I'm an American and I support my parents. No, it's because Donald Trump ultimately is not a geopolitical actor. So he's absent from this, which in turn is a problem. But Donald Trump responds to domestic American politics. And while I can go on for a long time about Republican this, Democrat that, and why America may or may not have voted for him and what will or will not happen, that's a domestic American political issue that has almost no relevance to geopolitics other than its outcome. So if you ask me, is Trump going to attack North Korea, I can't really give anything that would be relevant to how geopolitics would function. Because when the time comes for Trump to decide yes or no to attack North Korea, it's going to happen. Do I think that people will like me if I do it? It is a problem, but I think the more serious issues for Poland to think about is not worrying what are the poll numbers in Pennsylvania in the United States. It's thinking about where is Poland's place in a world with a Russia of questionable future that definitely wants to show off its capabilities, and a China that's absolutely trying to create, we'll call it an alternative to an American-led order, even if not necessarily challenging it directly on. Obviously, there's considerable more details like we brought up here, but that's the end of the slides I have. So I think I will stop talking and stop soliloquizing and let Jacek ask some questions now. But thank you for your attention to all this stuff.
Maybe I will just modify the scenario a little bit, and we will move quicker to the Q&A section, and I'll skip this, section of a few questions that I would have, because I think it will be more interesting for the audience to participate in discussion. Plus, usually my experience has proven that this active participation is producing better results in conversation. So maybe let's open that phase, and I don't know if someone will be moderating, and if anybody wants to ask the question, put the hand up and go ahead. If you just could stand up, introduce yourself, and ask the question.
Hello, I'm Kasper Skowik. Nice to meet you, Mr. Myers. I hope you enjoy your stay in Warsaw. I have two questions to Men of Sea. The one is Russia considered in a long-term or even mid-term perspective an ally to the US, as its pivotal role in the Eurasia, against China? And what happens to Poland if it is? And the second question is if there is any plan in America if the Russians collapse.
First of all, I always enjoy coming to Warsaw. The food's great. The answer to the first one is slightly simpler than you might think. No, Russia's not perceived as a friend in the United States. And there's a pretty easy reason that you can see this. People in Poland were very concerned when Donald Trump won the election that there would be this great Nixon in China moment where Donald Trump would fly to Moscow and they would come up with a brand new deal to contain China and make America great again, because we've never been friends with Russia for so long. And no one in Washington is letting Trump do it. It may be that Trump just never had the initiative in his head. It may be that he wasn't smart enough to come up with the plan in the first place. But all American institutions are so stacked against Russian Federation strategic interests and wanting to contest any effort that Russia is using to undermine the West and the perception that's currently prevalent in the United States that there is no perception of friendship with Russia, especially Russia, the country. On their second point, though, is there a, continue on the second half of the first question. Would Russia be useful in containing China? Theoretically, yes. But this is not being considered actively by U.S. planners. I do think that this is an active consideration in Moscow, that if China did decide to start a conflict that the United States is now being drawn indelibly into, whether it's over Taiwan or the Diaoyu Islands, whatever it happens to be, that Russia, instead of being the pseudo-ally that gets reported in the news, would communicate to the United States and say, we have a bunch of nuclear weapons and we sit right next to China. I bet we can influence this for money. This may be a real possibility that Russia is planning, but if it were to do so, I believe from the U.S. experience, even if that deal was accepted, and I don't think that there's any way to predict whether or not it would be without knowing the specifics of how the conflict was evolving at the time, if Russia then came and said, and as the price of our glorious friendship, we want you to get out of Poland and the Baltic states to improve relations between us more generally, the United States would say, yeah, we might consider it, and then never do anything. I don't think the United States would ever be, any U.S. politician would ever be politically able to withdraw from an area because Russia said so, even if Russia was being useful elsewhere. So there were various individual moments during the Cold War when the Soviet Union did assist the United States in some diplomatic angle. Most notably, probably the Suez Crisis, where the Soviet Union and the United States cooperated to end the British, French, and Israeli invasion of Egypt. But it did not result in any meaningful reduction of U.S. commitment to Western Europe. So, some good news there. And what was your second question? No one's planning for it, because if anybody did predict it in the United States, they would be called crazy and probably fired from their office for predicting the collapse of a sovereign country. It's a U.S. bureaucratic problem. So right now, there may be some people in think tanks who talk about it, but the problem there is, suppose Russia collapses, how would it collapse? I really can't say. I've studied Russia a lot, and I can see a number of fracture lines that may or may not succeed, but there is no active plan for what to do if Russia collapses as a country. There may be plans for how to make Ukraine a bit more safer if Russia abruptly withdrew, but that would be the most that the Americans have concretely planned.
My name is Jacek Bartosiak. I'm a local here at Warsaw, and I have a question regarding the Russian military build-up of the recent years. Now, over the past couple of years, we've seen numerous pieces of information about new tanks being acquired by the Russian army, aircraft, submarines, all kinds of military equipment, either of new generation or refurbished Cold War equipment. Now, with the dropping revenues from oil sales and gas sales in Russia, there has been talk about the potential of Russia lowering its military expenses to a considerably lower level than it is at right now. Now, my question is, how much longer do you think can the Russian government sustain such levels of expenditure, military expenditure, and an expansion of its armed forces?
That's another good question that if I knew the answer to, I'd probably have a much better paying job at the moment. You are correct. There's a lot of reason to suspect that Russian defense capability is being actively hurt by inability to do the procurement that they want to. The most visible example is that we've now seen a T-14 Armata tank come out every so often, and it always looks different, and it's probably all fake. There may or may not be a warehouse full of them waiting to all come out at the same time to show, yes, we built 500 of them all at once. Again, there's a sort of a dearth of evidence one way or the other, because Russia can hide things that they really try. But my suspicion is that, at the very least, it's been actively harmed by doing this. What I can say with proof is that Russian, I call them destination exercises, but when Russia used to do all these major exercises, they'd say a snap exercise of somebody moving from Samara all the way to Leningrad Oblast in order to practice getting to the Western Front. And they did this ridiculously often in 2014 and 2015, despite the fact that it's slightly more expensive for Russia to do those exercises than it is for NATO. And I don't know any alliance as good at wasting money as NATO is. So that the disappearance of those large-scale exercises, because they just don't do them anymore. And when they do, it's like 100 people going to test equipment. Strikes me as there is a serious reduction in the ability to logistically support a major operation that would be necessary for fighting NATO, hypothetically. But how much longer can Russia sustain its relatively elevated budget of today, which they've kept more safe from their economic difficulties than the other aspects of their budget? It is a good question. I would conjecture probably they could probably keep it up for a while, but they're going to be forced to stop procuring tanks and increase procurement of people. And the reasoning for this is there's been a large-scale information campaign within Russia to get the Russian people interested in joining the Russian military at long last, standing up Yunarmeyets and having all these public ceremonies to celebrate the military profession. 10 years ago, the only story about this, 15 years ago now, the only story about this that we ever heard in the West were these Russian mothers protesting hazing rights going on in Chechnya, which the behavior has improved. It's not completely gone, but it has improved. The Russians are going to find increased utility from spending money on people and therefore having them give money to their family members than they will get from doing increased procurement of technology or tanks. And that is good news for the West because that is how militaries fall flat. In the United States, at the end of the Cold War, Bill Clinton decided that he was not going to do any further procurement of future technologies to fight the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was gone. So military spending in the United States became 50% of personnel because he wouldn't fire anybody because he wanted to get reelected. And as a result of that, all these readiness issues completely collapsed in the 1990s because we were no longer practicing how do you exercise this or what future technologies do we want. So a lot of the new technologies in the United States are as a result of R&D that's started long after the 1990s, and now we've moved into a different era. But if Russia is forced to do that sort of transformation, keep the people motivated so as to keep the country cohesive and everybody happy with a high defense spending because we're all milking it off of this, that's good news for the relative security of Europe from Russia.
I've got a question about your. You mentioned that Russia really perceives Western attack. I mean, they really believe the NATO attack is possible. So I'm wondering, how do you see that? Because it either means that Russia is paranoid and irrational, or it means that they got the wrong intel, or they know something that we don't know, that the West is really considering an attack on Russia. So how do you see this?
You're specifically net attack, you mean like cyber, or?
You mean that you mentioned that Russia really believes that the West is behind the Ukrainian coup, right?
Yes.
So it means that the West is really interested in attacking Russia in the future, which means that it either is the truth and we don't know it, or it means that Russia is paranoid, or it means that they got a wrong intel, which is not very likely, I would say. So how do you see, why do you believe that Russia really believes that the West is interested in attacking it in the future?
I believe it's paranoia. I think we tried one hypothetical exercise, like how much could the West take if it really did a serious invasion of Belarus, and it crashed pretty rapidly because we don't really practice how to do that. We tend to so much of our NATO logistics relies on the population being friendly that we would never be able to pull it off. Paranoia has a long history in Moscow, so this wouldn't be the first time that all of Moscow's strategic interests were driven by the perceptions of individuals and not as the perceptions of the interests of a country. I don't know if I don't want to bring up too many historical examples of this because I think people in the Poles have a much better historical memory of this than Americans tend to, about how Muscovite paranoia caused insane problems. But the Russians would be willing to construct an entire story based around keeping themselves strong, and a good way to keep the Russian people committed to whatever the Kremlin is up to is by feeding this argument that the West is coming to get them. But at this point, the reason why I'm so convinced that the Russians do believe that there is a coup in Kiev is because Ukraine was Russia annex, that area that was the useful, Russian, there's the term, the useful idiot that sits on the sidelines and is an extra oligarch that prevents the West from getting closer because it's so dysfunctional. And as a consequence, I think Russians did actually perceive it as some guarantee of peace because there's this giant area that can't really be used in a conflict in a hypothetical conflict between Russia and the West. And now that Ukraine is actively anti-Russian and is inviting NATO to exercise on its territory and has aspirations to join NATO, the prospect of there being a Ukraine that, even if it doesn't act on its own behalf, has potentially U.S. forces of operational capability so much closer to Moscow itself can't be anything but a peril that the Ukrainians would not even wish upon themselves, and a Muscovite perception of this. And again, like perceiving that they're that much closer to Moscow is going to feed whatever paranoia there already was. I think it's that specific breakdown. That it's the specific story going on in Ukraine. More larger, why the Russians would talk about how the West is an inherent threat to themselves is very much how to keep up the perception of Russia as a necessarily strong place amongst the mindset of their larger population. I hope that makes things slightly clearer.
And that brings us to the question that I wanted to ask you. Okay, it doesn't work, so I try to speak loud. The question of Ukraine popped out, and the question of Belarus popped out if we talk about buffers and Russian perception of threat. So, what do you think? What is your opinion about Nick, about the future of this belt of countries between Poland and Russia, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea? And generally about the Intermarium project as a sort of, what is your attitude towards that?
Well, I've now studied a lot of the details of the Intermarium, as you know, so much that it's difficult to pull back out and look at the whole forest again. One of the things that I found curious when I was first learning about the Baltic states was that in an American classroom, if you go to a session about Central Europe or Eastern Europe, and you ask about the Baltic states, they say, oh, no, they were part of Russia, so they go to a Russia class for that. If you go to a Russian class, they say, no, they've joined the West, so they don't count anymore. So they kind of fell into their own little crevice that the United States didn't really pay attention to, and they've now made a considerable mark back into the limelight, not only as places on a map, but cultures that we learn about and how distinctly not Russian they are. Lithuania has a very long history of independence, as well as condominium with Poland. But there's a shock there on both sides. So the United States never really paid attention to them. Russia never really thought of them as serious either, and now all of a sudden there is a NATO presence there that makes them not just the vulnerable section of Europe that Russia could potentially snip off to embarrass the West. It's now something that Russia needs to very seriously plan for if they wanted to cause a conflict. So in that regard, the visible importance of the Intermarium, I think, has irrevocably increased so long as Moscow continues to do what it's doing. Ukraine is a lot more troubling to think about because as much as they've remained a lot more resolutely pro-Western than I think most people were expecting after the Maidan Revolution took place, the fact is that the current government, for all of its international messaging, has not changed the fundamental problems of Kiev's governance, which is that it is an oligarchy, was an oligarchy, and appears to not be doing any serious efforts to reform how the country functions, such that if for whatever reason Kiev flipped again, and I don't know what scenario would cause that, it became not necessarily pro-Moscow, but neutral again, I don't think that there would be much difficulty in Russia resuming business as usual as it was beforehand, because nothing has really structurally changed there. There's a lot of discussion, I'm sure here as well, but around the entire West, about how Poland and Ukraine were so similar in 1991. Now Poland has completely gone off differently, despite the fact that, unlike the Baltic states, Poland had strong traditions and history, that some of which wanted to be preserved, and that always makes it a bit more difficult to change than it would in countries like the Baltic states, where they wanted to dump all traditions they had because the traditions were foreign imperial domination. But Poland has succeeded. The first time I came to Warsaw 4 years ago, by some accounts, when you go around the downtown, you can hardly tell it was a communist city if you're just looking at the various skyscrapers. You see the hints of it as you see them rebuilding everything and the sidewalks that have all the communist edges, but nowadays you kind of have to look for it. As an outsider, I'm sure it's different living here. So, put simply, the Intermarium's visibility has increased, but without necessarily changing its components. Frustrating way of putting it. As the Baltic states were already pretty pro-Western before this happened. They're just now being cared about more. If there really is a new influence being inserted into this area that wasn't there before, it is China. Like Romania is a very interesting case study where the Romanian government is being as faithful as they can to the United States because of the efforts to put in Aegis ashore, as well as bring them into NATO and treat them like the European country that the Soviet Union never treated them as. So they want to be faithful to the United States. At the same time, China is coming in and offering to help with refurbishing and rebuilding new nuclear plants and other Belt and Road deals to improve ports and such. Where is Russia in that debate? Russia's nowhere in the Romanian debate. Like no one is, in as much as they count for anything, it is, well, we don't want Ukraine to flip back over to a pro-Russian entity because that would mean that the Russians might be closer to our border. It's entirely adversarial. But if we go back 20 years, 50 years, however many years you want to go, active consideration as to whether or not we balance China in the mix of our foreign policy, that is new in terms of especially domestic European politics. But even if we go back to the 19th century where there were fewer European countries and therefore they were thinking much more about foreign policy, China was something you manipulated. They don't affect foreign policy. If they really want to try to change British tax policy, we'll start a war with them. So that I think is the truly not necessarily making this area more prone to war, but truly displacing activity going on in Europe today. Russia, if anything, is proving to be more of a stabilizer of European military decline than anything else.
Hi, Wojtek Sip, thank you very much for the insightful talk. I'm wondering if you could comment on two recent trends or developments in the Polish military. So the first one is the purchase of the Patriot anti-missile systems, and the other one is the sort of rebuilding of the Polish National Guards, if you will. I don't know how familiar you're with both of these things, but if you are, I'd be interested to hear your perspective.
So I don't get too deep in this because I happen to know this is a matter of some controversy in Poland, both of these issues. I was actually asked about the Patriots at another event yesterday, and my response, I think, was as disappointing to the audience as it was to me, and it is having Patriots here has the immediate impact of forcing Russia to use standoff weapons from the air against Poland if a war were to happen. I don't know what else it really adds to Polish security. Now, that said, if Russia is shooting standoff weapons from over Moscow against Poland, number one, it means it complicates Russian planning. That's not bad. The Russian General Staff doesn't like to start wars it doesn't think it can win. And number two, if it's having to use these hyper-sophisticated weapons that everyone's going to see and no one can possibly ignore, it may simplify NATO's decision to commit to Polish defense. And by simplify, I mean maybe a faster decision, maybe more countries join on because it's such a visible act of war. Not that bombing a country is really an invisible act of war, so again, it's like it adds something, but what it is adding at the strategic level is very debatable. And if anybody has additional answers beyond complicating Russian bombing plans, I'd be more than curious to hear them. On the Territorial Army, this is something that a lot of European countries are waking up to. I mean, Lithuania is another clear example that people talk about how the Finns managed to keep a functioning territorial army, not only during the Cold War, but after the Cold War. The question is, always like, what is the advantage of having additional manpower to stop enemy momentum coming through the country? In Poland's case, if Russia started a ground war in Poland, it would almost certainly make it simpler for the Polish regular military to do a destabilizing operation that prevents the Russians from succeeding at any of their frontline efforts. So I do think that there is a serious tactical, operational, and strategic advantage to having a functional territorial army. The main disadvantage of having it is that this is how you base your deterrence. It's extremely expensive. To mobilize a territorial army in the modern world case might destroy the economy for years. So preferentially, there would be other ways to do it. But I can clearly see that the existence of a functioning territorial army would do enormous strengths for convincing the Russians that the Polish military is not going to be stuck defending a whole bunch of cities that will have to go near or through in order to achieve the objective of getting to Warsaw in the midst of a hypothetical war. That opens up this many options for the Polish military to utterly destroy us at various other things. And from my personal interactions with the Polish armed forces, the officer corps is clearly improving its ability to react to those hypotheticals. So the Russians are rightly worried that that would be a potential issue.
Marcin Golański. I wonder to ask you, what is your opinion about the military fact that at the beginning of this week, the U.S. Army destroyed some troops, Russian troops, paramilitary troops in Syria? And what do you mean that will be some response from Russia, maybe in Europe? This is the first question. And the second is about intermarium. Do you think that the barrier of increasing role of intermarium is the Berlin, or it could be Berlin, because it's some evidence that at the beginning of 90s, sorry, that Berlin put some resistance to increasing role of intermarium in the past.
So your first question on Syria. I have been traveling during that course of that, so I've only seen hinting references to it. There are a couple of implications that immediately come up. Several reporters have noted that Putin must have ordered this attack since they knew that there were Americans present at the position that was being attacked. So clearly there was some degree of escalation going on there. And obviously the U.S. military did not hesitate in responding forcefully against them. Russia's ploy in Syria is a curious geopolitical experiment. So at this point, I'll go back to the military districts map of Russia here. So of the 4 districts excepting the northern one, all 4 of the district's commanders are now veterans of the Russian campaign in Syria. And the last 2 acquired a Syrian veteran in the end of November 2017, after Zapad was over. In all of these districts, there are serious efforts being implemented to acquire the lessons that they have learned from Syria. They frequently put it in their press releases, learning the lessons from Syrian Arab Republic. If this is really a major turning point in how they perceive the future of war, it's possible that they're considering becoming their own pole of influence in the Middle East. That would be, if they're taking that on in addition to challenging the West, that's going to bankrupt them pretty fast. So it's possible that they might be switching away from doing something with the West because they perceive that as too expensive. But calculating or thinking about what options Putin would have to escalate against the United States in this case, since the contractors were killed, I don't think that there's going to necessarily be a Russian reaction to this. I think this was much more a Russian experiment with what the United States would do under these circumstances, knowing that these are Russian contractors coming at them. It's been the experience in both the United States and Russia that when you have hired military contractors in a conflict zone, especially in the Middle East, the government tends to consider their lives a lot less valuable than their own servicemen. So it would make sense that if Putin wanted to experiment with how much he could get away with, he should send those guys in because he doesn't necessarily need to make a statement afterward. Whereas if a Russian serviceman was shot in the course of that by U.S. forces, that would clearly require any retaliation that he could come up with. But if you asked, how could Russia escalate? They might declare, for instance, that the movement of Iskander to Kaliningrad, even though it took place beforehand, is an appropriate response. This is how Russia can own a message. Even if it had nothing to do with Syria because it happened beforehand, he could claim it was and get away with it. Or he could say that we're putting forward an extra battalion in any number of formations, or we could add artillery to this, or he could just have a large exercise close to the Baltic state borders or to Polish borders. There's a lot of random things that Putin could decide to do to respond that would not necessarily have any long-term impact. If he wanted a long-term impact, he might make a frosty statement to Lukashenko, who then turned that over to the Western intelligence to see that clearly Putin is not happy with things that are going on in Europe. But one thing I have learned from several war games which I've been tasked with playing Mr. Putin is that when you are trying to control Russia today in a Putin style, you never stop talking. Because if you're always talking, the other side has to respond to all the nonsense you say. And if they're wasting their time thinking about that, by the time they come up with a halfway decent response that people haven't necessarily listened to, I can say the next thing, and now you have to start over. Meanwhile, I'm planning whatever I want to do elsewhere. So don't disregard Putin's ability to create a response, even if he didn't actually have one.
Berlin. The question
and Berlin. Honestly, I have not studied very much the history of German policy since the end of the Cold War, other than how much that they have decided to neglect defending anything and let their military fall apart pretty much entirely. It's something that when I talk to Cold War veterans in the United States, they are always upset about because they usually spent decades defending West Germany during the Cold War, and now they don't care. I think it is entirely plausible that they decided that we don't want to think about the Intermarium afterwards. The Intermarium was not part of NATO in the 90s, so they may very well have done that, but I have not studied that issue, so can't really give a competent answer.
Good evening. My name is Tomasz Szelbiniak. I'm interested on a bit different, let's say, strategical directions of Russia. I lived for the last couple of years in Georgia and Caucasus, and I was interested if there are any signs of any military preparations for actions of that direction. Like you suggested that they are already a bit overstretched. Like you said about the problems with, I don't know, the equipment. There's not much enough to even fill the Zapad exercises, for example. So they have to take those smaller units instead of sending out the full divisions. Like for example, what I heard, what I know, there are new pipelines built to transport Caspian oil to the west, etc. Something that would really irritate Russia, I don't know, 10 years ago. Or the war in 2008 was probably much because of that. Do you think they lost an interest, or they are overstretched too much, or there are any signs of their plans in that direction?
So, so Russia does 4 of these strategic operational exercises, and they do them in a rotation. So Zapad is the one for the west, and then they do one. It's the one that comes directly before Zapad. Is called Kavkaz, where they practice operations both in the Caucasus and against Turkey and the Black Sea generally. They do have some sort of plan, but I don't see any particular need on their part to increase their presence there at the moment. In no small part because Georgia has been pretty defanged. The Russian invasion of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and then further operations against Georgia in 2008, or counter-invasion, I suppose, because of Georgia, was in many ways the Russian version of the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War in American history textbooks is that war we won against Spain because we were so much more powerful at the time. But if you look at the logistical history, everything broke down. As America didn't have any practice on how to invade anything at the time. So there's the story of Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. They have the picture of him on San Juan Hill. Well, Rough Riders means he should be riding a horse because they were cavalry. But there's no horses in the picture because their horses were sent to the wrong island. So they ran up the hill. Russia's invasion of Abkhazia and South Ossetia was the same sort of thing. Everybody flying in every direction, nobody really communicating with each other. And they won because, hey, there's more Russians than Georgians. Congratulations. We can just pile it on. But as a consequence of seeing all the problems they ran into on intercommunications from that war, they really improved their C2 structure as a consequence. Today, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, there is a marked decline. Well, in South Ossetia, there's a marked decline in regular military exercises. They will do occasional inspections and make sure that everybody knows how to operate the equipment, but compared to what they do in Transnistria or Abkhazia, it's virtually non-existent what they do there. In Abkhazia, the overwhelming thing that they practice is coastal defense, because I think this is part of a broader perception that NATO, no matter which element of NATO, could potentially start an extra front either in the Ukraine conflict or in a larger conflict with Russia by doing an amphibious assault in the Sochi area. Whether or not that's at all realistic, or they're just making it up, or need something for those soldiers to do, so they just decided coastal defense, go. That's what they're doing. They occasionally do other battalion tactical group maneuvers, but the short answer is that in Georgia, Russia now has what it wants. Georgia can't join NATO because to do so would have to renounce its formal control of those areas, or NATO would have to decide, yes, we're taking on Georgia, which could be perceived as an act of war. And I don't believe NATO's in any position to do that. So there's... I'm going to change the subject slightly. In Syria, there's a lot of interesting analysis going on about how Russian movements overlay with energy fields. Like, to what extent is Russia only playing for control of the energy there? I don't think it is a non-existent theme, but so long as Russia has such a presence in Armenia and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, if they really try to do Caspian hydrocarbon movement exclusively through Azerbaijan and away from Russia into Turkey, and it was something that the Russians really didn't like, then the Russians might try to do something arbitrary about stopping it. But with the S-400 sailed to Turkey, I think it's clear that Russia doesn't perceive the fact that increased influence to Turkey is going to be a problem for it. Because at this point, any increase in Turkey's relative power within the West is a decrease to perceived NATO cohesion. That may change as Turkey does what Turkey does, but we'll just have to see.
Mr. Meyer, my name is Daniel Kovalczyk. I have two short questions. One, what do you think about Trump's military budget? Especially, I mean, the fleet, he has now the new idea about generating two groups of fleet, which one is the main, which is waiting outside, and one is more operational. Second thing, referring to one of the articles on your blog, does Belarus actually need its own armed forces?
Which one?
Belarus.
Belarus, okay. What about, just what is Belarus and armed forces?
Does it need its own?
No, it doesn't need its own. I see. Trump's military budget, I have to admit, I have not read it. It is long, and I am not really an American military expert. I know a number of considerations about how a conflict with China would go in the Pacific, so I could get to some more, I could talk about specifics. But in general, this sort of wide-ranging restructuring of the Navy, as you said, this is not the first time I have heard of it, but I believe it is being expressed by think tanks in Washington, not by the Pentagon. The Pentagon is considering a restructuring of the Navy to reserve command and control from the rear in order to have increased operational cohesion both at the front and in the back. But I also know that within the Navy there's considerable pushback against that because that would completely upend all the traditions of how the United States operates in the Pacific. And then there's a lot of talk, not a lot, but increasing talk of removing aircraft carriers from the Atlantic entirely. This is unrealistic in the near term exclusively because Navy traditions are going to ally with whatever is saying, no, we need a carrier out there. So I don't perceive any short-term major changes to the U.S. Navy. The one that's most realistic to be adopted as policy, if not necessarily implemented, is this 350 ship concept. Already, a problem that the United States Navy has run into is that we have so many large ships we're afraid to lose, so therefore we don't really know what to do with them in the event of a war potentially getting one of them hurt. So 350 ships, in my opinion, now we're getting to a completely different subject, is not a solution. 350 ships is carpeting over the fact that we want this many big ships that can do cool things. What we really need are a lot more than 350 ships, but a lot cheaper than what those 350 ships are perceived to be. Go much more towards what Russia has successfully done in its naval restructuring, and what China has been adopting as well, of having a larger number of small missile craft that can inflict damage, and if you lose them, it's not the end of the conflict. This is something the Chinese are really experimenting with, is using naval targeted missiles to cripple an aircraft carrier, like maybe injure a couple dozen people, not necessarily sink it and kill thousands of Americans, however many is on board at any given time, because that can limit American options. At the same time, make it very much that the United States has to decide, all right, this is a real war we're going in, which has all the implications of nuclear war, which everybody knows is no fun for anyone. And your second question was Belarusian armed forces. Do they actually have independent control of them? There are several trends in the Belarusian forces that are different from Russia's. And in the grander scheme of things, I believe that the Belarusian forces are there to complement Russian capabilities, however that ends up being in a hypothetical conflict between Russia and NATO, whether or not they're going against the Baltics, or whether or not they're going against Poland, or whether or not they're just defending the border while Russian forces go forward and actually make an effort to get in. That, I think, there is not really an independence of mind in the Belarusian armed forces. They have to do whatever is going on in the context of a broader conflict. But Lukashenko has been moving a lot of the forces in the Belarusian army out of the regular army and into his territorial forces. And by doing so, he's decreasing the training of the conscripts because, for a variety of reasons, but he doesn't really want the army to be so powerful that they can potentially be used against him if the Russians control the military. The interesting thing is that this is the opposite of what Russia's doing. Russia is making everything heavier, adding more servicemen into the regular army, and abandoning in many places, not everywhere, but in many places, the transition to the brigades that was undertaken with the Serdyukov reforms in the late 2008 to 2010. Belarus's brigades, as a consequence of this transition, have actually improved their readiness and capabilities of the individual Belarusian soldier. It's still not a very large force, so it's not like something you should be scared of, but as a fighting implement, I've noticed that they are getting better, which in many ways is emulating what the Russians were trying to accomplish back in 2010 to begin with. Now, what is all this? Does that mean that they are no longer within the Russian orbit? Well, not really. During the Cold War, American analysts like to say, oh, Poland hates Russia, so they would never fight for the Soviets in the event of a general war between East and West during the Cold War. And the answer was, yes, Poland doesn't like Russia. Yes, Poland wants to be free. Are they really all going to not follow the orders of the Soviets pointing a gun at them if a war were to start? I think it's much more similar to that than anything else.
Any more questions?
One in the back.
I would like to ask, what are your opinion on Russian A2AD systems and access or denial systems? Because what they actually allow in case of regional balance of power is to change it to that extent that you don't actually need so many forces to occupy other countries or to act under this umbrella of A2AD. So what is your opinion on this? Because evolution of precise strike and change how war actually happens today. And the second question is somehow connected towards it. Have you noticed that actually Belarus had increased its cooperation with China, especially in the case of military affairs and military equipment, especially with their missile systems and some land forces equipment? So how do you think that's connected with maybe some will to escape from Russian influence?
So I'll take the second question first because I think it's a bit easier to answer. Belarus is absolutely increasing its cooperation with China, and it's doing so under the guise of Russia was already in Belt and Road, so why not we take some free money too? They have taken some technologies. I don't think they've massively implemented many yet, but there's definitely an effort to get to make sure that when Belt and Road is constructed, that the rail line does in fact go through Minsk, and I think it currently goes through. I forget if it goes to Grodno or Brest now, but when the Chinese say, "Oh, we sent a train from Beijing to London directly," it does always go through Belarus, and they're very proud of that. One thing I will mention, one of the secrets of the trade that I've learned, if you want to see all military developments in Eurasia that are relevant to the overarching security balance, and you can read Russian, is follow the press releases of the Belarusian Defense Ministry, because they republish things that have nothing to do with Belarus, and it's only what they think of as important to the changing balance. So they'll probably say, like, Vietnam acquires frigates. I have no idea what Belarus cares about that, but they specifically only focus on what's actually rebalancing Eurasia. It's rather interesting. I think someone in their press department just likes reposting stuff and puts it on their website. Now, on the first question, A2AD. It's a very interesting point, because A2AD has extremely different effects at a strategic and the operational and the tactical level. First thing I would point out, the Russians do not use the term A2AD or anything similar to that. It's something that the West thinks of, and I don't think it's a bad concept for the West to think of, even though some elements of the United States military are trying to phase it out because everybody puts it in their death by PowerPoint slides. What effect does this have? The first one at the strategic level is it adds complication to how you would act in a particular area. And it means that a lot of things are now suddenly downrange from Russian systems that don't have to move. They could shoot at a moment's notice. But at the operational level, how does this impact NATO's counter-planning against this? A2AD capabilities really just mean, well, kill those first. So for example, S-400s over Kaliningrad. How would you deal with them? You would use Tomahawks from somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean or the North Sea, or cruise missiles launched from aircraft flying from Britain, maybe even as close as Denmark. And what impact do they have on the war if they're then taken out in one operation? Well, they spot time. Maybe a couple of hours, maybe a couple of days. But if you're buying time, you're getting closer to when the Russians have made it to the point where we've made it as far as we can go. How do we keep whatever we have now without killing all of us? And so in that effect, they are useful to Russian operational planning, Russian operational planning and strategic thinking, not even as we have a target list for the Iskander. They might, but they may very well also see that a Tomahawk's coming, so shoot all of them at whatever we find on the radar right now. But the impact is really, of these A2AD systems around Russia, is that it forces the West to slow down. Because when the West decides to engage in any operation, they want to minimize casualties as much as possible, which means we're not going to fly a whole bunch of aircraft that might be useful in the defense of Poland, either at the tactical level or otherwise, until those S-400s are gone. I don't think that there's any reason to believe that the S-400s, the Iskander, or any other of these weapons, maybe even the ones in the Far East in the event of a conflict even in Europe, will last the war. Will last a week, definitely. Will be gone within a week. Maybe gone within 24 hours. But again, that means that those 24 hours, the Air Force and the submarine missile forces are all thinking about destroy all of them, and then we'll go on to what's next. There's a preoccupation. I don't know so much if it's a problem in Poland, but there's a preoccupation in the United States with coming up with hypothetical strike lists for giant missile systems. Like if you get to the point where it's a nuclear war, you want the list of everywhere you're going to blow up. I think there's going to be a lot more improvisation if it were ever to actually happen than these hypotheticals and journals and so forth come up. Even though there is, in fact, a military plan, I bet it gets tweaked wildly. And in Russia, it's even more completely respond tactically to what the situation is, as opposed to put in Iskanders in Kaliningrad so we make sure that Polish aircraft don't fly from this base. Because the answer is if they're there, the Polish aircraft probably aren't going to fly until they're gone anyway.
Regrettably, we are coming to an end, so that will be the last question. The gentleman there.
So there's been recent events in, I would like to call it Polish foreign policy, more like internal politics, which has effects on international relations, causing like PR crises. I mean, the conflict with Germany over war reparations, with France over cancellation of the helicopter contract, generally with European Union on the judicial reform, or the recent spat with Israel over the Holocaust history. So yeah, they get a lot of attention from the media. They get letters from US Department of State with condemnation or worry. But what real effect it may have on Polish relations with America and the wider Western Alliance, and specifically in times of any crisis situation with Russia, would it have any influence of the amount of assistance we will get from the West, or is it completely irrelevant in times of real crisis situation?
Last but not least, huh?
So I am not a Polish citizen, so I'm not going to talk about the politics of that. But I can say is that as this has come into the news, it has been recorded in the West, and I have been surprised by the degree to which it's being instantaneously looped in as this is part of a bigger trend going on in Central and Eastern Europe, that Poland is now the next Hungary. That is how it is overwhelmingly described in British, German, and American newspapers that I read. And honestly, I would treat it in a security perspective in a manner similar to Brexit. The United Kingdom has gone bent over backwards to say we are not leaving NATO, we're leaving the EU. And the United States has made it pretty clear that Brexit has no bearing on us whatsoever. And I don't think I've ever heard, especially not the Trump administration, make any qualms about what Poland is doing. There have been internal debates I'm aware of, but nothing that would mean that in the event of a Russian security crisis happening in Poland, the day after the Polish foreign minister says Polish diplomacy makes a new controversial point that would have any detrimental effect on the commitment of American forces already here. And there's a secret in the United States, well, the secret to understanding American people, that if you kill one American, they all want to come back and finish the business. I mean, a group of 19 terrorists destroyed 2 towers and crippled a section of the Pentagon, and we invaded 2 countries over it. So I wouldn't worry too much about it from a security standpoint, but I would say that it is having a long-term detrimental effect on some predominantly center-left people in the West. There are some people I know in the United States. I wouldn't call them the majority, but I know some people in the United States who approve of Poland's diplomacy, but they are not in the government. As we come close to the end, though, I do want to finish with one anecdote that is good news for Poland. This was written about by Dmitry Gornberg, who was at a security conference in Russia a couple months ago. I don't think it was Valdai, but it was some specific conference. And midway through it, Vladimir Putin decides to show up And it was a happy occasion because they didn't know if he was going to make it. And he sits down with the moderator, and the moderator starts by saying, "Oh, welcome, Mr. President. We didn't know if you were going to make it, and we don't know how many more times that you will be able to join us." And Putin responds with a smile in his Putinistic witticism. "What, you mean you're not going to invite me after I retire?" And everybody in the room chuckles, and then, having just talked about Russian security the whole day, starts to groan as they all wonder how long the Russian Federation can last after Putin is gone. And it became the remainder of the under-the-table discussion of the remainder of the conference. So, to a certain extent, time is on Poland's side. So it's not all bad news as far as Russia is concerned, but another aspect to bear in mind.
Thank you very much. That was all for today. We hope we will be having Nick more often in Poland. So thank you, everybody.